For over 40 years, nearly 150,000 customers and over 30,000 channel partners spanning the globe have trusted ArcServe to strengthen their data resilience, recover lost assets, and ensure business continuity. With a unified approach to data protection and recovery, world-class technical support, and the lowest total cost of ownership, ArcServe helps businesses manage, defend, and most importantly, recover their data from any solution. Hello, everyone. My name is Sean Massey, and I'm the America's VP of Sales for ArcServe. Thank you so much in attending our latest segment of Beyond the Arc. This talk will not be any type of sales pitch, but rather be a discussion on industry trends and the effect it has on partners and customers. And today we are talking about SaaS applications. And I'm really happy to have with me Niels Van Ingen from Keep It. Niels is the Chief Product Officer for Keep It. Niels, it's great to have you here. Thank you for carving out the time and spending some time with us.
Yeah, hey, Sean. Nice to be here this morning. And again, looking very much forward to the topic. Having been in data protection for 20 years, I'm really dating myself. Yes, I'm old. I've seen sort of this shift from on-prem to cloud, and obviously it's accelerating still, not just from a workload perspective, but also the use cases. In some ways, it feels like Groundhog Day, but lots of exciting things to talk about here.
I mean, no doubt about Groundhog Day. In fact, I just saw that that show, the movie, just actually within the last couple of weeks. But very good. But really, when we think about the trends, looking back especially in the last 10 years, really have seen a lot more of movement with folks moving like their compute, their servers, their applications from on-prem to really kind of either a SaaS or an off-prem method. Would you agree?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, if you look at, we've talked about cloud, I think, for 20 years, but I think what's interesting right now is that cloud is not done. Actually, we're going through a major motion around cloud modernization right now. And a big part of that is not just, going from out of your data center and move it basically into the cloud and then still operate your infrastructure. It's more and more going to SaaS, right? So at Keep It, we believe ultimately everything will be delivered via SaaS. And the numbers and the analysts are talking about that as well, right? So if you look at 2028, they sort of predict 75% of enterprise apps are going to be consumed via SaaS. And there's a whole bunch of things that come with that. And what a lot of customers and sort of the curve we've been going through is customers sort of realizing and think about what does it actually mean to me? And there's still some notions in market, and certainly what we see with customers to say, well, when we move it into, or we're adopting SaaS, or we're moving into cloud, all of a sudden I don't know any of it anymore. I outsourced it. I don't have any responsibility, and that's not necessarily true today. And that awareness around it is still something that's very, very important for customers to understand. In order to realize what they need to do about this, to make sure, and again, in an insecure world, that they're protected long term in the same way as when they had all their stuff on prem.
I totally agree. And actually, one thing that you said in there was, when folks think, oh, I'm just outsourcing, and just want to underline that and underscore, when I think of outsourcing, I think of actually you're having a company really taking over, and they're doing all aspects of whatever that is, right? Whatever it is that you're outsourcing.
Exactly.
And that's not necessarily true with SaaS, right? And so we've got this really shared responsibility model. And I think that's really kind of an area that I think many businesses don't necessarily realize. They think, oh, good, I can get it out of my building, but they don't realize that they have extra duties, actually, or not extra duties, but still they have responsibility with some duties to
Correct.
that application.
They still have some of the same duties, right? So what you saw in the on-prem days, you basically understood that you're responsible for, your CPU, your compute, your servers, your network, and your data, and ultimately having appropriate measures to protect that. When a lot of customers, when they move to cloud, or especially when we're talking about SaaS, they think, hey, it's all moving. And what they don't necessarily always realize is that, yes, the cloud vendors are responsible for the application, are responsible for the infrastructure running it. but not necessarily for the important things, which is your data, your configuration data, and all that type of stuff. And what makes it worse is that the vendors delivering those applications, and Microsoft is a good example, but you can also talk about Salesforce, you can talk about different things there. When it comes to capabilities to protect the piece that you're responsible for, they're not necessarily there. And so from a customer perspective, at that point you're exposed. And that's really what you need to be thinking about, especially again, if you put it in context of, the majority of your apps are going to be actually consumed via SaaS.
I mean, really spot on there. And I think, when folks are are looking at their applications and really their data for a company, the data is really the lifeblood of that company, right? Without that data, that company probably doesn't exist.
Correct.
And when we move it to the SaaS vendors, and we don't have an appropriate sense of what's our responsibility, something happens, then really kind of, catastrophic things can happen for that company itself. And at the end of the day, um, you need to have the data, and that data needs to be in a form that where you're able to access it and be able to use it in a meaningful way. Now, I put up on the screen, I like this graphic actually, and you look at the SaaS application. It's just this huge, monstrous iceberg, right? As we do that, and when we think about what is the SaaS vendor's responsibility, and from a broad stroke standpoint, the SaaS
Mm-hmm.
vendor responsibility and the user responsibility, you can actually see, and I'm sure you would agree with me, you can see there is a lot of critical items that the SaaS user needs to make sure that they're taken care of, right? The vendor, like Microsoft 365, M365, they're going to make sure that it's up and running and the network is there and the hardware and all that good stuff that's there. But when it comes down to, the the actual data belongs to the individual business. And I think, Microsoft, in fact, I know Microsoft has in its terms and agreement, talks about, hey, your data is yours and it's your responsibility to make sure that you are backing that up. Microsoft is not going to handle that.
Yeah, and I think a lot of times when and this has sort of been the education curve, and also why I talked about Groundhog Day in some ways, having been in the industry for a long time, both on the data protection, data management, and things like archive and e-discovery. Um, Often we talk, when you talk about data protection, people think backup, but actually, really, what you should be thinking about is actually what does recovery mean in SaaS, right? Because it's different than when you had things on-prem, where based on the amount of money you spent, you can sort of hit any kind of RPO, RTO. With cloud, and especially SaaS applications, that's different, simply because the method, everything is an object, and so recover, and everything has to go through public eyes. So recovery becomes a different thing. So it's not just about how fast you restore, but a lot of times before you actually start recovery, it actually, can I get access to the data that I need? And if everything is, for example, in Microsoft, and that gets hit by some type of event, do you actually have access to it? And can you become back operational? That's one part. I think the other piece that's sort of ahead of us, and sort of the iceberg, the piece that you don't see, but probably the piece that actually sinks you, is, what's coming, right? So it's not just about backup and recovery, but it's also more and more about, what do I need to do from a compliance perspective? What do I need to do with the data from maybe an e-discovery perspective, data management perspective, insight perspective? And that's what I mean by Groundhog Day. I think, some years ago, many companies started to solve for that, and then things went to SaaS and into the cloud, and it sort of, it was sort of, everybody could do whatever they want. And we see that on the Microsoft side with, the adoption of Teams, for example, where in email it got a lot more structured over the years. We're going through these same things, and that's only going to get infused by, one, how people work, but also by things like AI ultimately infusing that. And so if you put that in context then of SaaS applications and your business, you really need to think about, what is it that I need to be solving for? And that's your responsibility, not somebody else's.
Absolutely. And, I'm also reminded, so Niels, I've had a wide variety of different a background, right? And so there was one point in time I was an IT director for a high school, and then I worked for a solution provider, a VAR, for many years
Hmm.
as a senior engineer, and being in front of being dispatched, for instance, on-prem to a company that has email down, right? Their email server is down, their Exchange server is down, and the same company that when we had talked to them about disaster recovery and business continuity and how important, which maybe even just a short time before that would say, oh, you know what, we could be down for a week and
Yeah.
we'll be okay, right? That same company then, just their email application being down, I have the owner or the principal of that company standing over my shoulder and asking, when is email coming back up? I really need to get in there. I've got stuff that I need to do, right, to be able to do that. And I think that just your point about, what does recovery look like? What does that what having just that service available, having the data available, just because it's being managed by Google, or being or that the infrastructure is at Google or the infrastructure is at Microsoft isn't enough. We need to make sure that we get in and are really dealing with the ins and the outs of not how your data is protected, but it is about that, but also what does that look like? We need to recover. We need to bring things up, as quickly as possible.
Yeah, exactly. And that comes back to sort of understanding capabilities from the SaaS vendor perspective, and then what else you need to do around it. And I think, from my perspective, that's still where, you just see a level of sort of education that needs to happen, and a level of immaturity, right? So if you really think about and have the conversation, what is your DR plan for these applications? What if this disappears? How are you going to actually resolve that? And what you find in a lot of companies are not necessarily having their hands around that right now. Not always clear who's responsible, because this is the other thing that makes SaaS a little bit harder. IT used to have a ton of control. Pretty much everything that ran into the organization was ultimately sort of approved and controlled by IT. If you look at SaaS applications and say you have 100, you'll find that 40 are sort of, approved and controlled and blessed by IT. Not that doesn't make, but often again, still not necessarily sort of a DR planning around it. But the other 60 are just, delivered and delivered and utilized by parts of the organization where IT doesn't have that control. And again, that number is increasing. So companies really need to think about, okay, in my business context, to get to results, what is critical to me? How do I protect it if things go bad? Because again, we're certainly living in a more and more insecure world. And I know something like ransomware, which we've all been talking about for 4 years, it has become a term and everybody sort of accept it and start glancing, but ransomware 2024 is different than ransomware 2019. One, how they attack, but also the impacts on the business when bad things happen, and you got to be ready for that. So this whole idea of DR planning and taking your SaaS application and your SaaS dependency into that, and ultimately come up with a plan, becomes really, really important for business to to ultimately be protected, if you will.
Yeah, excellent point. And as we kind of pivot, that kind of almost sets us up, you know, specifically for Microsoft 365, but this could pertain to certainly other SaaS applications as well. But when we're looking at like Microsoft 365 and we look at Entra ID, which used to be called Azure AD, right? The ability to make sure that that is protected in some aspects, Niels, I would say that is a very extremely higher priority than, I mean, we want to make sure that we're protecting it all without a doubt, but that is like the brains of everything that we're running in M365.
Yeah, and actually not just M365. So if you think about your cloud environment, why is Entra ID there, right? So we had Active Directory, and we all understood that if you want to run your environment in Active Directory, and most, 99% of our companies run in a hybrid mode, that you have to protect that and you have to be able to recover that. It's again, it's sort of a weird sort of curve that I've seen in this cloud adoption, if you will, and you also see it as part of this modernization happening. Where 5 years ago we had to sort of, there was still, and it's still happening today, where you have to educate customers on why you need to protect data in SaaS applications, so your data plane. In on-prem, that was all understood that you had to protect it all. When we went to SaaS, we kind of forgot about that somehow. So we had this discussion around, okay, you need to protect your data, what's in M365, And now we're having more and more the discussion around exactly what you're talking about, but what is controlling all these things? And Enter ID is, again, not just MT3X. Enter ID, controls probably the majority of your cloud environment. And what happens if you lose that? And again, most customers don't have necessarily a good response for that. But just think that through, right? Ultimately, like you said, I like the whole brain versus body. Like if you break an arm and you lose some data, that's one thing. But most people, if they go skiing or they do ride bicycles, they protect their brain for a good reason because it's really harder to recover and controls everything else. And that's really how you have to think about Enter ID. The other thing I would say is that as we adopt more and more SaaS, more and more cloud stuff, then the importance of Enter ID is growing. So even is growing. The other notion that's out there that customers are not always aware of is that a lot of customers think, well, we sync between Active Directory and Enter ID, so we're covered. It's actually not true. Like if you think about Enter ID, it has all. If you have objects there in Active Directory or Enter ID, they both anchored, meaning all the information lives on one side and then part of the information lives somewhere else. But if you really want to recover Enter ID fully, and this is really where your cloud pieces are solved, then you have to protect that ultimately, because otherwise you're just not going to be functional. And that's a really important piece, because if you think about this from for example, ransomware bad actor perspective, guess where they're focusing? It's not just your data, it's actually much more the control point. So thinking about control planes and data planes and what you need to protect in context of SaaS is a very important consideration if you think about your overall DR strategy.
Yeah, it reminds me, Niels, it reminds me of the story, a little story time now. It reminds me of the story of there was a company in Carlsbad, California. I think this might be back in 2017. And they had a contractor that an IT contractor that worked for them. And apparently, as I know it, things didn't go well, and they kind of had a hard separation, right, between that company and the IT contractor.
Right.
And certainly, I don't know that the full details. I'm not quite sure whether this contractor still had their account active and
Right.
ability to use, or whether they had determined a backdoor, or whether they just hacked in on another one. But they basically got into that tenant, so the management of the admin piece of the tenant, and then deleted 1,500 of their accounts. Now, when we
Mm-hmm.
think about that, I mean, the data is still there. The Exchange data is still there. The OneDrive data is still there. The SharePoint data is still there. All that's there, but the accounts themselves were gone.
Right.
And because those accounts were gone, it basically rendered that company just useless for several days. And when you think about it from an IT perspective, how do I bring that back? They didn't have a backup of their Azure AD at the time, or Entra ID would be called
Yeah.
now.
Yeah.
And that what that means is that they would have to go in and manually start re-adding in all the users, and then connecting all of those different resources together in order for them to be back up and functional. And I'm sure that took months
Yeah.
for them.
Yeah, exactly. You talk here about a couple thousand, right? But apply this to Intune, try tie it to group policies and everything else, and the problem becomes pretty big. And I think this happened in 2017. If you look at it in 2024, yeah, it's a different play, because again, if you look at sort of how companies get compromised, it's not necessarily via malware anymore. It is much more about ransomware attacking certain things, but also insider threats. So, for example, this person would be considered an insider threat ultimately. And think about your company. It's easy to think about, if they have proper access, what can they do? Wipe out Entra ID as a whole and then trying to recover with really not having any native capabilities in Microsoft to do so. That becomes a really big thing. And while you're down, right? Ultimately, all data is not accessible at that point, not just within your Microsoft environment, but also, again, other pieces in your environment, not Microsoft related. So it's important to consider on how you protect it, but and also how you recover from that if bad things happen. That's what you should assume.
I mean, absolutely. And I think now I'm just looking at the time. We've only got a minute or two left. So let's talk a little bit about best practices for protection. I mean, number one, we need to make sure that we are protecting all the data. right? We need to
Correct.
make sure that we've got the actual raw data that's there. And what I would suggest is that folks would go regularly and they're testing the restore of the data. They know what that looks like. They know ahead of time what it's going to take in order to restore a whole mailbox or a SharePoint site or whatever case that might be. In addition, we need to make sure that we're backing up the brains, right? We need to make sure that we're protecting the Entra ID piece, and I have folks, and you've probably heard this a million times too, Niels, I have folks that will say, you know what, Sean, I'm fine. We're we do hybrid. So we've got an on-prem AD that
Yeah.
we back up, and we back that up with a backup software, that so we're protected. What would you say to that? I don't mean to
Well,
put you
again,
on the
what I
spot.
said earlier, no, what I say to that again, the answer is you're going to be surprised when you really need it, because again, it's a
Yeah.
subset of data that's basically synced both ways. And so the data you need to become fully functional is not going to be an Active Directory and vice versa, right? From an Entra ID perspective. So again, the bigger thing for me is again, just ask the simple question. If something bad happens, Entra ID gets encrypted, we lose it, or we lose this data, what does it mean to the business? And if there's not a good answer, meaning, hey, we cannot recover, or hey, the native capabilities, meaning, hey, there's some stuff living in a recycle bin for 30 days, that's not good enough for us, or it's just not there at all, make sure you understand it and then plan and act appropriately. And that's the biggest thing right now, because if you ask those key questions early on and you don't have a good answer for that, that means you're exposed in a world it's getting more insecure, every day.
Yeah, and that hybrid environment also is sometimes a jumping off platforms for bad actors in order to get access to to
Exactly.
to the Entra ID in general, and just as you said, they keep different types of data, right? So it's not everything is all kept at once. And
No,
then finally,
exactly.
I would say really is when we talk about best practices to protect. I want to go back to um, the tried and true backup method that we used to talk about all the time is the 3-2-1 method, right? Uh, Basically, 3 copies of your data, 2 different types of medium, and an offsite. We
I would
that
actually
has
add what I actually would add one to it, 3-2-1-1, because
what
what really becomes important with the last one, if you think about again the threat landscape, is you really have to think about immutability, and it should not
Yep,
be immutability by policy. It should be immutability by architecture, because that's ultimately a key target for the bad actors. So one, it needs to be separated. So have keeping data. If your SaaS vendor is Microsoft, to also have your backup there. Does that make sense? Probably not from a security posture perspective. But the immutability part is also a really big key, ultimately making sure that again you have the ability to recover.
yeah, I mean, great point, and that so it's 3-2-1-1.
One, yes.
Yep, yep, 3-2-1-1, and as we look at that offsite piece, just to make sure that offsite piece when we're looking at 2 different types of media, I think you just mentioned this. We want to make sure that we're not putting all of our eggs in the same basket.
No.
If you're backing up Microsoft, right? You should not be putting your backups in Microsoft Blob storage, because then if Microsoft has a catastrophic event, then not only is your production data gone, but also your backups are gone too.
Yeah, and it's not even catastrophic, right? It could be just you lose control over your access within your tenant, right? It's sort of the same
Right.
idea as if I have a PC and I have all my pictures on my PC, and my wife has a laptop downstairs and he has the same thing. If my house burns down, it doesn't do anybody any good. They're gone anyway.
Well, great point. It was wonderful talking with you, Niels. Thank you so very much for joining us today. Again, everyone, Niels Van Ingen from Keep It. It's great having this discussion with you. This concludes our session today, our Beyond the Arc session. Um, Remember, protect what's priceless, and data resilience doesn't just happen. Goodbye, everyone, for
Exactly.
now.
Take care. Thanks, Sean.